his religion. The source material of this is an article which Dr Ambedkar published in the Mahabodhi Journal in 1950, so 70 odd years ago. This is fairly available online for free, so do feel free to look it up and read it for yourself. It's quite an inspiring read, actually. And one of the things that kind of occurred to me was that how we here in Triratna, in a way, are still unfolding that inspiration and bringing that kind of vision to life. It's quite a visionary paper that's still having effect 70 odd years later. So there's probably too much really to explore fully in the time that we have available. And in the paper, Dr Ambedkar sort of quite methodically and systematically asks a series of questions around his own religious thoughts or needs, those needs of society, and how that can be met by religions other than Hinduism. So the entire thesis, in a way, was that, as we've learnt through this series, that Dr Ambedkar was born a Hindu, but had stated in his life that he did not want to die a Hindu because he saw the caste system, which was enshrined within the Hindu religion, as a great barrier to the growth and development of the vast number of people in India. So his thesis was, if not that, then what? Really was the basis of his question. So rather than explore what he postulated about different religions or so on and so forth, I've really just kind of focused more on the sort of systematic way about which he went through that process. I felt slightly uncomfortable about discussing religions that I have no direct experience of myself. I do have direct experience of Christianity because I was brought up as a Christian before becoming a Buddhist. So I feel that I can quite comfortably mention Christianity, and my experience of Christianity was wholeheartedly positive at the time as a child. So it's just a kind of a thing about being Buddhist as aware, is that our experience is primary to some degree. We need to look at things within our experience, things that are external to our experience. I don't feel quite so comfortable discussing. So I'll leave those aspects of this article for you to explore yourselves. I'm just going to be kind of outlining the process that was gone through. So just to sort of go back to try and put ourselves into the situation that Dr Ambedkar found himself. I mean, if I look round here and I imagine in Zoom, I doubt many of us were born into Buddhist families. I wasn't born into a Buddhist family. I was born into a Christian family. But if we look at the period of Dr Ambedkar and even previous generations for ourselves, the religion that you were born into, by and large, was the one you just stayed with. So if you were born Christian, you stayed Christian. If you were born Hindu, you stayed Hindu. If you were born Jewish, you stayed Jewish. It's quite a recent phenomenon that we can become... we're quite lucky in a way. There's sort of three aspects that we're quite lucky to have. We're lucky that we live in a free society where, various different religions can flourish. We're lucky that we have access to Google and libraries and so on and so forth, such that we can find out about other religions. We're lucky that we're free to follow any religion that appeals to us. And in a way, we're also free to completely reject religion, should we so desire. And many people in the West at the moment, many people in Great Britain, just reject religions entirely. And actually that's quite a positive thing in terms of our freedom. That wasn't really the case for Dr Ambedkar, and it wasn't the case in that situation and for previous generations even here. You were just born into a religion, and it was very difficult, very challenging, very hard to change that religion. You were just kind of stuck. And many people that Dr Ambedkar was trying to, as it were, save from the caste situation had been for many years just stuck there. They didn't have the freedom to go and choose like we do. So as I said, Dr Ambedkar was born into the caste system as a Hindu, one of the lower castes, had stated that although born there, he didn't want to die there, largely motivated by the injustice of the caste system. So he was then left with the choice to either find an alternative religion or to reject religion. So at one level that was his first kind of choice, to find an alternative or to reject entirely. So when he kind of reflected on that, I can imagine him sort of going through these series of questions and reflecting deeply at each point. So during his reflections on should I find an alternative or reject, he realised that he himself was quite religious. There was a kind of a need, a want, a yearning for a religion in his life. The alternative of rejecting religion didn't sit well, didn't feel proper or correct. He felt a need for religion just somewhere in his being. And above that, he also felt that all human beings were essentially religious in spirit, that all human beings had that kind of need, that all human beings had that some sort of yearning, something that's hard to put your finger on, something that's hard to identify clearly, but that we're aware of. We're certainly aware of if it's not there. So the option of sort of rejecting religion just diminished into the distance, that there was clearly then the only option was to stay with the religion he had or to find an alternative to it. He felt that humans had a need for religion, or needed a religion for their own spiritual growth, their spiritual well-being. And over and above that, even more reflections from obviously a very deeply thinking man, he felt that in addition to a need for religion for our own spiritual well-being and our own spiritual growth, religion is necessary for the well-being of society. So I'll just spend a few minutes kind of slightly unpacking how he worked that out. So he worked that out through the kind of the sense that religion is a system of beliefs that govern behaviour. It is a system of beliefs that governs behaviour. So for us here in a Buddhist centre, those beliefs could be encapsulated by the 5 precepts, or 10 if you become an order member. So that's the system of beliefs that governs the behaviour of Buddhists. And also that those systems of beliefs in the Buddhist sense, the 5 precepts, Christianity, the 10 commandments, these systems, more than the law of the land, govern the behaviour of people in society. So more than the law, it's a system of religious beliefs that governs how we are within society. So how people generally act creates a just or an unjust society. So there was a direct correlation, as it were, between his reflections on his own individual need for a religious system, the beliefs of that system governing the behaviour of individuals, and how collectively behaviour of individuals, kind of influenced by religious beliefs, governs whether a society is a just society or an unjust society. So a very deep sequence of reflections coming from Dr Ambedkar in a very difficult situation on the need for religion and the connection, as it were, between his yearning, his kind of existential yearning, and how that religion can influence the entirety of the society that he lived in. At the time, it was a society in a degree of turmoil. It wasn't too long after the Second World War. There were lots of stresses and strains on that society. And he's troubled, Dr Ambedkar. So we can see a direct correlation through these steps of reflection from an individual to the governing of how a society is perceived by the people in it. So the next question, after being clear, as it were, that there is a need both individually and collectively for religion, that the earlier premise was that Hinduism was not meeting adequately, from his point of view, from the injustices of the caste system he was living in. The next question was obviously, well, which religion should one follow? Which religion would he choose? And Dr Ambedkar at the time understood that this wasn't just a simple question for him. He was acutely aware of, as Sadraja was mentioning earlier, the hundreds and thousands of people in India trapped in a caste system that was unjust and that was oppressing their flowering and their flourishing as human beings, that would follow him. He was looked upon as their leader, in a way, and decisions that he made were highly influential to all of these individuals. So this wasn't something that he could just do for himself. He was well aware of the implications for hundreds of thousands of other people who looked to him for some ideas, salvation, whatever. So in order to answer it, he set about quite systematically, quite scientifically, and extremely thoroughly exploring other religions. To do that, he met many representatives of other religions and interviewed them and questioned them, and he read very widely. So by the end of it, I'm sure he was quite an expert in the major religions of the world. So his thoughts and opinions and so on and so forth on many of them, I won't be going into. I'll just be kind of exploring more from here, the sort of the criteria leading towards the choice of Buddhism. So Dr Ambedkar compared, as it were, the leaders of these main religions. So that was the Buddha, the leader of Buddhism, Jesus for Christianity, Muhammad for Islam, and Krishna for Hinduism, which he would already have been fairly familiar with, but went further and deeper in his reflections and explorations and questions of all of these religions. And there's a few things that he concludes that was quite special about the Buddha, as opposed to either Jesus, Muhammad, or Krishna. So one of the things that he realized was that Buddha is not a god, but enlightened. So the Buddha himself said that he was neither man nor God. He was not something in between. He was an enlightened human being. So he was a human being. He was born flesh and blood, and he died of flesh and blood. His body was flesh and blood. What was special about the Buddha was his mind. And what separates the Buddha from run-of-the-mill humanity was his mind. The Buddha had gained what we call his enlightenment. And enlightenment means that he was completely in alignment with reality. He had moved away, he had broken through all of the barriers that we have in our minds that cause us suffering. He was no longer subject to greed, hatred, delusion. So his mind had broken through, we could say. So it was his mind that was special about the Buddha. The other thing that Dr. Ambedkar realised was special about the Buddha was that the Buddha gave his followers the means to their own liberation. So he gave them the means to their own liberation. He taught them how to get there themselves. The other leaders, by and large, gave liberation, if you like, in inverted commas, or salvation, or whatever it might be. Maybe it was more of a sort of Christian word. By virtue of their own divine grace. So their divinity, their godlike status, allowed them to bestow liberation or salvation or whatever it might be on their followers. The Buddha did not do that. What the Buddha gave us was the means by which we can get there ourselves. He had achieved enlightenment. He told us how to do it and then left it up to us to get on with it. He didn't give it to us. And it was very empowering, there was a very empowering difference between the kind of grace or salvation that we could be given by Jesus or Muhammad, whether he felt like it or not or whatever, and a simple path that we can all follow to achieve things for ourselves. This was one of the markers of the Buddha, which Dr. Ambedkar felt quite impressed by. It was also true that the Buddha didn't use any supernatural powers to prove authority. So I remember from my Bible studies days as a lad when I was taken along to church on a Sunday, actually really loving all the Christian stories of the miracles of Jesus. I thought they were great. The Buddha didn't do that. The Buddha didn't use any kind of supernatural powers to prove his ability. He was content to teach and for us to test it ourselves. And lastly, just to carry on with that, the Buddha invites his followers to try out their teaching for themselves, not to just accept his word. So to hear what he's got to say, to think about it, and to see whether you think that this is true or not in your experience. So a further consideration about the religion to choose was important for Dr. Ambedkar. So he could see that there was something slightly different about the Buddha as a leader of a religion. But looking at the actual religion itself, he concluded, no doubt after much reflection, that reason and experience should support any teaching, not be at odds with them. So any teaching of any religion that was likely to attract the attention of Dr. Ambedkar as a potential alternative had to be in accord with reason and experience. He was a very highly qualified scientific man, which you can see clearly through this stepwise, logical way that he went about the question, and reason and experience had to accord with the teaching, not be at odds with them. So if we think about some of the basic Buddhist teachings, there would be things like conditionality. So we explored conditionality at Sangha night over several weeks a while ago. It's basically the tenet of conditionality is that all things arise independent upon conditions. Now, when I was a young lad growing up in the 60s and 70s or whatever, and being taken to church on a Sunday and loving all the stories from the Bible, and loving, meeting people at the church, the reason it all sort of went a bit awry for me in Christianity was when I was getting older and being a bit more of a rebel, as you do when you hit teenage. But also I was progressing at school and learning about things like Darwinian evolution. So I was learning about fossils and things arising and passing at different eras and different ice ages causing things to arise and pass away. And different finches evolving in different islands in the Galapagos, and fossils and mammoths and dinosaurs and so on and so forth. All of that I found absolutely fascinating. And there was something for me learning that seemed to kind of jar with the Bible didn't talk about dinosaurs and woolly mammoths and so on and so forth. And there was a jar between my kind of interest and belief and sense that something about Darwinian evolution was beautifully, elegantly presented, and the truth. There was a jar between that and what I was reading in the Bible, and what we hear about creationists who feel that the word of the Bible is absolutely unquestionable. So what Dr Ambedkar is pointing at is that for him, the religion that he was going to choose couldn't have a jar like that. So I drifted from Christianity, partially because of that jar, partially because I was getting older and interested in other things. But I've never gone back. It was Buddhism that I discovered later on. So we have things in Buddhism which are like the law of conditionality or the teaching of conditionality. There's the Four Noble Truths, that there is suffering in life, that there is a cause of suffering, that there is an end of suffering, and there's a path to the end of suffering. And then that leads to the Noble Eightfold Path. There's a teaching on the three lakshanas. That all things are impermanent, that all things that are unsatisfactory, and all conditioned things are devoid of an unchanging self. Now we may or may not kind of understand those teachings, as it were. We may or may not be able to get up and give some sort of learned talk on those teachings. But if somebody does explain those teachings, or if we read about them, at some level they need to chime as being true. We can't have them as jarring with something else in our experience. So we can't be reading about impermanence and having a conviction that something is impermanent. We can't be reading about conditionality and having a conviction that something that we can point at or name is not subject to conditions. It isn't there because of supporting conditions, and if those supporting conditions are removed, then that thing, whatever it might be, would cease to exist. We can't have that jar. And it's important, it was very important for Dr Ambedkar, and it's important for all of us here, that in a way is our experience, that our reason and experience, as much as we can understand for the moment, accords with the teachings that we're hearing. So, why in the end Dr. Ambedkar chose Buddhism? So he felt that society, the society he lived in and the society that we live in, all societies must have sanction of law and basic morality. And he felt that law affects quite a small number of people. And that it is therefore up to the basic morality that sustains, as it were, the calm working of society. Now, I thought about that one, and I thought that's probably true. So there are lots of things that I can do that are legal. So I was thinking I could gamble. There's nothing to stop me gambling. But I don't gamble for a number of reasons. One is that I don't think gambling as a practicing Buddhist would have a very positive effect on my mind. So I'm aware that feeding craving, which gambling would do, constantly trying to get the big win, something that the craving that would engender and feed would not be good for my mind. I know that from my experience. I just know that as a truth for me as an individual. So I don't do it, even though the law of the land allows me to. I also don't gamble because I have had a brother-in-law who had a bit of a gambling problem, was a bit addicted, and it caused a huge amount of suffering. So I've witnessed the effects of gambling, and I've experienced the effects of things on my mind. And I can choose to do things that I know have positive effects on my mind and to avoid things that would have a negative effect on my mind. And I do that irrespective of the law. I don't not steal because it's against the law. I don't steal because it's one of the precepts of taking the not given. And in fact, stealing is just a subset of that precept. That's quite a wide precept of taking the not given. And I know that that's important for my mental states. I would like to maintain positive, metaphysical mental states. And to do that, there are certain things I just don't do. Other things I do. And all of that I do, completely irrespective of what the law of the land allows me to do or stops me from doing. So I think it's a very true statement that the law is there, but actually the basic functioning of people going about their day in the land is much more governed by our individual morality to the extent that we explore morality. And Dr. Ambedkar, therefore, from that concluded that religion is the vehicle, as it were, of morality. And that must maintain or remain as the governing principle in society. And that religion must operate in accord with science, or in another word, reason. So a reason that we've explored must be in accord with the teachings of that religion. And if it doesn't accord, then tensions arise. So I explained, my own tension as a mid-teenager or whatever, learning about Darwinian evolution and finding that somewhat at odds with aspects of the Bible and its explanation of creation. I mean, that was a very it was a personal example, but somewhat glib when you think about the tension in India, where you have hundreds of thousands of people feeling disenfranchised, millions of people potentially feeling disenfranchised. Them rising up or rebelling or whatever was quite a serious threat to the society of India. It was quite a serious threat to the well-being of hundreds of individuals who could have ended up being killed. So these were not insignificant questions that Dr Ambedkar at that time and in his situation were addressing. The consequences of tension in that society could have been very, very grave indeed. And he was not unaware of that. In a way, that was why he started in the first place, but why he was very keen that he made the correct decision at the end of his deliberations. But sort of slightly turning that on its head, it was also clear to him that reason, or science, does not have to prove religious beliefs. So looking at it from the other side, it is possible to have religious beliefs beyond the scope of scientific verification. So I was thinking about that one. I think that's a lovely statement, personally. I think it's very important that there are things that we can't entirely explain by science. I think it would be somewhat stale and dry if absolutely everything could be explained. I think it takes us definitely into the realm of faith, just to have some faith in teachings that we don't yet understand, some faith in the kind of continuing effort along the path leading to the goal. All of these things I think are very important motivators actually for us to continue practicing. So I do agree, and I think it's quite true, that reason does not have to explain all religious beliefs. There can still be an element of mystery. In fact, I think it's nice that there's an element of mystery. And to just recap what I think we covered in one of the earlier talks in this series, I forget which one exactly, the moral code of the religion must live up to the fundamental tenets of liberty, equality and fraternity. So these were the subject of our previous talk. So the moral code, as it were, just in summary, people must be free to follow it and to adhere to it. They cannot have it imposed upon them. They cannot have aspects of it refused to them. They must be equal, men, women, everybody must be equal to follow these teachings. And they must have an element of keeping an element of other regarding, we might think. So the moral code can't just be about your own individual progress. There has to be an element of other regarding, an element of doing things on behalf of others, a fraternity. And the other thing that Dr Ambedkar outlined was that religion must not sanctify or ennoble poverty. I thought this was such a clever and insightful aspect to how he came about making the choice that he did. That religious must not sanctify or ennoble poverty. Now that is not to say that renunciation is in any way wrong. So those that have are perfectly at liberty and indeed potentially encouraged to give up as much as possible, as much as they can, to be as generous as possible, to help and aid others. But what he saw was a major problem was the sanctification or ennobling of crushing poverty within which people had no choice whatsoever. The removal of choice was what he felt was a major disadvantage in some religions ennobling or sanctifying poverty. If you have the choice to be not poor or poor and choose to be poor by giving everything away, then that may well be a noble thing to do. But to be crushed and have no choice to be other than poor is somehow crushing your potential. And that was seen as a major problem in the reflections of Dr. Ambedkar. And I think we would all agree with that. So finally, Dr. Ambedkar, spoiler alert, he did choose Buddhism as the religion that he eventually converted to, and that several 100,000 Indians converted with, and are still converting and growing and developing Buddhist Sanghas in India to this day, which Sadharaja is very, very qualified to talk about, because he's a very active part of that process himself. Finally, I would just like, I've only got a couple of minutes, just at the end of the article, there's something very interesting, that Dr. Ambedkar had some reflections on the steps he felt were necessary to spread Buddhism. So the premise now was that Buddhism should be the religion that people convert to move them out of the oppressive regime of the caste system of Hinduism that they'd been living in, and that the precepts of Buddhism, based in accord with science and reason and our own personal experience, should be the precepts that help transform not just individuals, but transform the whole of Indian society. That was Dr. Ambedkar's aim, was to transform the entirety of society from one that he saw as being unjust to one based on a moral foundation that he felt would be much more just. So he had a few steps for the creation of this spread of Buddhism throughout India. And one was to create a Buddhist Bible, which I thought was a fascinating idea. If you go to the library just next door, anybody pops their head in, it's clear that there's quite a large canon of material to read through. And most other religions have something much simpler and pithier and easier to carry around and refer to. So Dr. Ambedkar was a fan of the creation of a Buddhist Bible. This has not yet happened. There are other opinions on that. But I thought that was quite an interesting point. I hadn't actually considered myself previously. He also felt that the Bhikkhu Sangha, as it's known, the Sangha of Monks, should be overhauled. He felt that the Bhikkhu Sangha was a little bit moribund as it was presented in India. So there were already Buddhists there. Wasn't like he was the first one. But he felt that their, as it were, exemplification of Buddhism as a way forward for society needed a little bit of sprucing up. He felt that the ideals of the Bhikkhu Sangha, the monks Sangha, should be as a model of society. So people should be able to look at monasteries of monks or sanghas of monks or however they were presented, and they should see something inspirational, not something somewhat dead. That the Bhikkhu Sangha should be there for the people to provide true and impartial guidance for those earlier on in the path. So they should be giving true and impartial guidance from their experience further on in the path to those that are a bit earlier. And that their mode of living, which is not what we do here, but their mode of living was to collect alms. They didn't do work. They didn't have to kind of do much cooking or anything like that. Most things were provided by the society around them. Not that that in it of itself was wrong, but that freedom that afforded them should be used to do service for people. It should not be used exclusively for their own enjoyment or kind of continued meditation for their own beneficial mental state. It should be used for the benefit and service of people. And finally, quite challengingly, and it is a challenging article, in several ways. Dr Ambedkar noted that what holds Buddhism back is the reticence of Buddhists. What holds Buddhism back from spreading throughout India or throughout society is the reticence of Buddhists. So I shall just finish by reading what he actually said, and then I'll give you a couple of questions for your groups for 10 or 15 minutes. So what Dr Ambedkar said in relation to the spread of Buddhism was that they must realise that the duty of a Buddhist is not merely to be a good Buddhist. Their duty is to spread Buddhism. They must believe that to spread Buddhism is to serve mankind. So I'll read that again. They must realise that the duty of a Buddhist is not merely to be a good Buddhist. Their duty is to spread Buddhism. They must believe that to spread Buddhism is to serve mankind. So I shall finish on that rather challenging note. I found it challenging. And in fact, I found it challenging, but I also found it in a way reassuring, because I felt that our founder, Sangha, who worked with Dr Ambedkar, they did overlap and know each other. In a way, that is kind of how Sangha has envisaged Triratna, how what we're doing here has been envisaged by our founder. So, whilst challenging, I also found a sort of slight reassurance that I was in the right place for it. So, as always, I've gone over a little bit, but I'll invite you now to break up into groups, probably just 2 groups, I think would be enough. 3 if you feel that you wanted.
2 groups of 5.
Sorry?
2 groups of 5.
Yeah, no, I think that would be fine. Yeah, 2 groups, yeah, I think that would be fine. So in your groups, do discuss anything that I've mentioned that comes up that might feel alive for you. Something from your direct experience is always something far more interesting than from a thought in your head. So feel free, but just as a guide, there are a couple of questions. So do you think, does the world need religion? And is Buddhism the best one to have? You might not know much about the other ones, like myself, but from what you do know, do you think the world needs religion, and is Buddhism the best one? And secondly, is the duty of a Buddhist not to be a good Buddhist, but to spread Buddhism? So is the duty of a Buddhist not really to be a good Buddhist, but to spread Buddhism? Are you inspired or scared by that statement? So, enjoy some time in your groups exploring whatever's live.